All right, so today we're talking about, did the Russian Revolution reflect the ideas of Karl Marx? And so today what we're really going to be talking about is the background to the Russian Revolution, because you kind of have to know a little bit about Russia leading up to the revolution in 1917 in order to fully understand it. So I want you to think about, before we start talking about this, think about how would Russia be impacted since they fought the Eastern Front of the war all by themselves. Remember, the Allies tried to bail them out with the Battle of Gallipoli and tried to create a second front in order to be able to resupply them, but unfortunately, was not able to win the Battle of Gallipoli. It was a horrible failure for the Allies, and Russia was still kind of left to fight by themselves. So the first question is, how is Russia showing signs of dissatisfaction? So Russia is a major power in Europe, just in part because of its sheer size, but has always been a little bit behind the rest of Europe. So the Tsar at this point is Tsar Nicholas II. He is the last Romanov Tsar. He's going to rule from 1894 until he abdicates in 1917. Prior to him, the Tsar was Alexander III. Now, Russia was trying to industrialize quickly. It wanted to maintain its position as a great power in Europe. Despite that, there still was a very small proletariat. Now, if you remember from last year, you might remember this, or if you didn't have me last year yet, you would not know this word. So I'm going to write it here. Proletariat is the term that means working class. So when we say working class, that is your group that would be your factory workers. And so Russia's proletariat was very small. It was only about 3 million people. 3 million people out of a population that in the mid-1860s was about 50 million, and by the start of World War I was 103 million. Throw 3% of the population, not very big. That kind of shows us that Russia really was not that industrialized. Now, the Russian czars were incredibly autocratic, which means they rule by themselves, auto meaning one, cratic meaning rule. So they pretty much ruled with a lot of power over the people. So the living conditions were really bad for that 3% of the population being the proletariat, and they were actively not allowed to organize into labor unions. The government would actually send spies out to infiltrate any of these labor groups to make sure that there was no sort of labor movement that was forming. So there was a lot of things that were kind of going underground because the people were upset. The people didn't like the working conditions and they wanted to change things. In addition to this, Russia had serfs until 1861. So when we say serfs, that's a term that goes back to feudalism. And if we think about feudalism, usually for Western Europe, you're talking about 1200s, 1300s, and usually by the 1400s, you start to see feudalism disappearing in Western Europe as we begin transitioning during the Renaissance period, and Europe begins to become a more modern society. But in Russia, in 1861, at that point only did the serfs get free. So prior to 1861, the peasants in Russia, which the vast majority of the population was peasants, they were bound to the land. They belonged to a lord. And serfdom in Russia was different than serfdom in any other country in Europe, because usually the serf was tied to the land. And that meant that the serf couldn't move, but it also meant that the noble had certain responsibilities to that serf and actually in some ways empowered the serf. However, in Russia, a serf could be bought and sold at will of the noble. So serfdom in Russia was more closely resembled slavery, say, in the United States. And actually, since they get their independence roughly around the same time that slavery ends in our country, there actually were parallel abolitionist movements almost between Russia and the United States. So when the serfs did get their freedom in 1861, because the Tsar was very much having the support of the nobles, he did not want to just free the serfs and therefore upset the nobles. So the serfs had to pay something. I'll spell what it's called in a second. They had to pay something called a redemption tax. tax. And the redemption tax was to compensate the noble for the loss of the serf. So from the serf's eyes, they're not really truly gaining freedom, because their whole lives, for generations, they've been at the mercy of the nobles, and now they essentially have to pay in order to earn their freedom. And these redemption taxes were very high, and a serf could not move until they had paid them off. So for a serf, it might take the rest of the serf's life in order to do that, or it might even take, say, like a father's lifetime into his son's lifetime for that redemption tax to be paid off. So there still was a great deal of resentment. Serfdom was done, or the serfs were freed in order to create a more modern workforce, to create that proletariat so that Russia could move towards industrialization. But because of the redemption tax, it was still kind of holding Russia back in a lot of ways. In addition, like I mentioned briefly before, between 1860 and 1914, the population in Russia went from 50 million to 103 million. So since this very much was a country that was still a country of peasants, this created a great deal of land hunger and further exacerbated the discontent amongst the peasants. Add to this, and here you can see this is Nicholas II and his uncle George V of England. Remember we were talking about in class how freakishly alike they look? It's really quite scary. Cousin Nikki, he was known as. So this is the Tsar and his family, Tsarina Elizabeth, and their daughters and their son Nikolai. Now, one other thing that also kind of added to a little bit of the discontent amongst the Russian people, or at least amongst the Russian boyars. The boyars, I'll spell that for you. That's probably not the right pen color. Hold on. I'll erase that. I'll use a... The boyars, that is the Russian term for noble. So the nobles also weren't too excited about Nicholas. And part of that reason goes to this whole idea of this guy named Rasputin. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. If you know the movie Anastasia, you probably do know Rasputin. So a common disease amongst the royal families is, because they were so obviously inbred, was hemophilia. So the Tsarevich, which is the little boy here, Nikolai, he had a disease called hemophilia, which means your blood does not clot, which means something like a simple bruise could potentially be life-threatening, because if your blood doesn't clot, a bruise could mean that you could potentially bleed to death internally. So hemophilia was definitely along the lines of the Romanov family, like I said, as well as along the lines of a lot of royal families back then. So... I don't know. So this guy here, his name was Rasputin. Rasputin, was a monk, and not very popular amongst the nobles. But the thing with Rasputin is he got in with the Tsarina, because for whatever reason he was able to heal Nikolai, the little Tsarevich, during like his most painful bouts of hemophilia. So a mother looking to her son who is in pain, her son who is sick, he's the Tsar's, he is the heir to the throne, he is the youngest, he is the only boy, he is like the darling of the family. She basically would do anything for this man because he could help her son. So there were times when Nicholas is off, leading the troops, which was another disaster because he didn't have any military training, was off leading the troops in World War I. He'd leave Elizabeth back in charge of things back in St. Petersburg, and she would give all the power to Rasputin because of the fact that he could help her son. So that did not make them very popular either, because everyone hated Rasputin. So here, as you can see, kind of like the concept of the early 20th century hierarchy. This is how the peasants saw it. That you had said, so it says here, while we work for them while they shoot at us, eat on our behalf, prey on our behalf, and dispose of our money. It was kind of the viewpoint of the upper classes in Russia. And you can see here's an early Russian factory. Now, because Russia, even though Russia industrialized late, because the country was so big, their factories were some of the largest in Europe. But they had a very weak economy. Most of Russia's industry was funded by foreigners. It was mostly foreign built. One of the major things that was built during this time period, though, was the Trans-Siberian Railroad, which gave Russia an access to their Pacific port, particularly Vladivostok, but it didn't really give economic benefits to the vast majority of Russia. So as a result, a bunch of different political parties began to develop to kind of protest the Tsar and his rule. One was the Social Revolutionary Party. This was formed in 1901. They opposed industrialization and wanted to actually have like a completely communal lifestyle. The other group was called the Constitutional Democratic Party, sometimes known as the Cadets. It's a C, by the way. They were formed in 1903. They would be what you would refer to in the 19th century, early 20th century as a liberal party, meaning what they wanted was a parliamentary regime, like a legislature. They wanted different government ministries to kind of rule the different aspects of the government. They wanted civil liberties, and they supported economic progress. So the second question, how did the Russian Revolution of 1905 change the government of Russia? And this is actually the second question, and the question that I'm going to finish with on this slide, and then we'll go over the rest of this in class. So again, we're still kind of giving you some of the background. So in 1904, Russia goes to war with Japan. And they went to war with Japan over this area here, which is the Liaodong Peninsula. There was a Russian port here at Port Arthur. As a result of the Sino-Japanese War, which was between China and Japan, Japan gained the Liaodong Peninsula. The Liaodong Peninsula was a very important holding for the Japanese because it was the first time that they gained a holding on the Asian mainland. The Russians forced the Japanese to give back the Liaodong Peninsula because they felt that this was something that was really in Russia's sphere of influence. So this is the Russian port of Vladivostok right here. Like right up here is Russia. So Russia felt that this was Japan kind of encroaching on their territory. They forced the Japanese to give back the port. This was considered like a great, massive humiliation for the Japanese. And so the Japanese launched an attack on Russia. And so this was a massive war. And the Tsar felt that him getting involved in this war would be a good way to kind of take some of the pressure off himself and the rising tensions that were building in Russia at the time, because he figured the Russians would be able to very quickly defeat the Japanese, and this would build all sorts of nationalism for the Russians. However, this was a complete crash and burn for the Russians. The Japanese soldiers and navy were able to really embarrass the Russians, like sink almost the whole Pacific fleet for Russia, and Russia is ultimately humiliated as a result of this. The war that ends this is the Treaty of Portsmouth, Portsmouth being in New Hampshire. Teddy Roosevelt was actually a major negotiator in this. He gets the Nobel Peace Prize for this. And so basically you had the exact opposite effect. Nicholas thought this was going to build all sorts of nationalism for him back in Russia, and it really just makes everything seem that much worse. Add to this, the unrest amongst the peasants and the urban working poor was getting worse. This man here, Father Gapon, decided in 1905, on January 22nd, he decided to start a peaceful protest outside the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. They were protesting the poor factory conditions, wanted an improvement in, working and living conditions. And as a result of this protest, the Tsar ordered the troops to fire onto the crowd. This is something that becomes known as Bloody Sunday. 100 people were killed. As a result of this, outrage ripped through Russia, because this was a peaceful protest led by a church official, and the people were killed. The Constitutional Democrats were demanding reform. Student strikes were breaking out all across Russia. The Social Democrats were beginning to agitate the workers. By October of 1905, St. Petersburg was basically controlled by a group of workers' groups known as Soviets, and that's actually where we're going to get the term Soviet Union from. So the revolution then spreads outside of St. Petersburg. Peasant and labor unrest begins to grow and becomes this much bigger revolt than the Russians could have ever anticipated. Russian Cossacks began to slaughter people in the Odessa. There were anti-Jewish attacks that began as a result of this. And so the Tsar felt that he needed to do something to gain control of the country again. So on October 30th, 1905, he issues something called the October Manifesto. And what this does is he grants a constitutional government. So in 1906, there was to be an election for a group called the Duma. And the Duma was going to be Russia's first legislature. Now, a radical group was elected. And the Tsar was like, well, no, this isn't happening. So he dissolved the Duma, called for elections again. Again, too radical. The Tsar didn't like the people who got elected. Dissolved it again. And finally, the Third Duma, the Tsar felt he could work with. It was elected by the richest people in Russia. So basically, every time they had one of these elections, he kind of limited the electorate until he got the electorate that he actually felt he could work with. And then in 1907, he had basically 700 rebellious peasants sentenced to death. So here we can see, though, this is the Russian Constitution of 1906, known as the Fundamental Laws. So still maintaining the autocracy of the Russian Tsar. The Tsar was the supreme over the law, the church, and the Duma, which means if the Duma passed something that the Tsar didn't like, the Tsar could just choose not to follow it. It confirmed the basic human rights granted by the October Manifesto, but made them subordinate to the primacy of law, aka he still had all the power. We start to see, though, the Jews in Russia, Russia has one of the largest Jewish populations in Europe, and the Jews in Russia were horribly persecuted throughout most of Russia's history, and particularly late 19th century, early 20th century. Russian Jews had to carry almost like passports. They couldn't own land. They couldn't leave their villages. They were victims of what was called pogroms. And a pogrom was like an organized riot sanctioned by the government where like the military would come into a Jewish village, burn the village down, beat up some people, and then leave. It was done to kind of keep the Jewish people from ever really having a sense of comfort or a sense of normalcy, because you never knew when one of these pogroms were going to strike. That's P-R-O-G-R-A-M. I just realized the way I spelled that on the thing doesn't really look very clear. And actually, a lot of these Jews left and came to America in 1906, and little did they know this was actually probably one of the best things that ever could have happened to them, because they completely escaped the Holocaust. Russia, along with Poland, are going to be the two places where the largest populations of Jews are going to be killed by the Germans later during the Holocaust. So the question is, why did the 1905 revolution fail? And there was many reasons. You could see here political, military, and social reasons. But what we're going to talk about in class is we're going to pick up with this question here. How did Lenin become the leader of the Bolsheviks? And the Bolsheviks are going to be what's known as, going to be basically the communists, and they're going to be the ones who are going to take over power in Russia.